Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to touch on two topics today in the 10 minutes I've got. So I'm going to whip through these at a reasonably high level. This whole issue of allocation options, why the need, and some of these have been answered this morning, so I'll skip over them even further. Why the need, what are the options, what are some of the pros and cons of the options, and I think we're overdue for a public debate on the issue of allocation, and I think that's where we're slowly getting to that point. And then I'm just going to finish with one comment about transition plans, the need for the separation of the initial allocation to implementation. This will be, I'm reflecting on work that we've had going on since 2006. I just went back through some old slides and pulled this one out. It's a presentation we gave to the councillors of Horizons Regional Council back in March 2007, and it was really around the start of their one plan process and around the fact that they have some challenges, the Upper Manawatu, Mangaton Oak, and then some lower reaches down around Harawhenua, where water quality is an issue. Upper Manawatu, certainly nitrogen is an issue, but also noting that sediment, phosphorus and faecals are an issue in some of their river systems, and they do have a large voluntary scheme around sediment under the Sustainable Land Use Initiative. So some of my comments, and some of these slides are actually old, but I think they are still very pertinent in the conversation today. So a little bit about allocation, why, and again, some of this has already been covered. You hear the word catchments are over-allocated. I mean, it's a lovely term, and we need clawback. This idea that, you know, they've gone they've gone to a state or a condition where maybe river users are noticing a degradation, and the pressure comes on to address that issue. I'd probably make the point that if we think about allocation, we probably need a case for all catchments, and that's really to provide certainty to the future. So in those catchments where there isn't an issue, we should actually have an allocation system in place now, so people have certainty, have a number, know exactly what they are allowed before they would have to mitigate. Also puts them in a very good position about future investments. What is being allocated? It needs to be made very clear we're actually allocating a public utility. The word this morning was used, the free allocation, but it is a public utility, and it's about the ability of our waterways to assimilate nutrients, and there's a point above that capacity that then those water quality attributes decline. And it's really important when you're thinking about the allocation approach, it's going to impact on future land use options. And I think Mike made this point. Our economy is essentially a land-based economy, primary industry. Looking forward, we need to, if we're developing an allocation approach, we've got to think about what it does to our ability around growth, but also about our ability to change. One of our great strengths is our ability to change in response to the market. An allocation approach, it's going to impact on wealth. Now, we've talked about costs this morning, but the word wealth hasn't been brought up. Any allocation system is going to probably reallocate wealth in one way or another. And lastly, the focus should not be limited to water allocation. We forget land's also a finite resource, and particularly our better land, it's very finite. It underpins our wealth. Because if you think about, if you're looking at a water outcome, often you could get the same outcome for a range of different uses of the land around it. So we need to be thinking about that into the future. Going back a little bit to the Horizon situation, we were sort of challenged with what are the options in the Upper Manawatu for managing down the nitrogen loading. Discussions were in the short term focus on what was identified as contributing disproportionately to that loading, intensive dairying. So one of the options was essentially just to focus on intensive dairying and assume there'd be no further intensification of other land uses. But when you think about that in the long term, you need a policy, must include all land and land uses in a catchment if you want an enduring solution. And so we were challenged to put up some options about what are some of the possible pathways forward. I suppose the MPS for fresh water brings that to a head and will accelerate that conversation up and down the country. What are some of the allocation options available? I suppose the first is just do nothing. It's just essentially carry on as usual. And again, some of these have been talked about today. Best management practice, that was the buzzword back in 2007. I think we've moved on from there. And you can talk about that with or without targets. Nutrient use efficiency was a flavour of the month around about 4 or 5 years ago, and it seems to have waned. It probably fits once you have a target and have a number, then nutrient use efficiency then has some validity. The concept of benchmarking and whether that's working towards a target is another component. Grandparenting has been spoken about today. Just simply focusing on and limiting the more intensive uses, so it could be targeted on specific land uses. And jumping through to where simply you make a flat allocation on every hectare of land, regardless of what it is. You've got an outcome in the river you want to achieve, you can allocate that back out over to every hectare in the same number. There can be no argument. Or recognise there are differences across our landscapes in terms of natural capital and adjust the allocation to reflect those differences in the natural resources. So we explored essentially two broad options. One that was effectively linked to current land use. And again, I'm not going to talk about grandparenting, you've all heard about that this morning. Or simply just placing limits on particular land uses. So that's around current land uses. The other option was explored, which was about decoupling that allocation from current land use. And I think this is probably where our conversation is going. And the two options we looked at were essentially calculating a loss on a per hectare basis that would achieve the river outcome without any making any distinction for the landscape. So take the river outcome, divide it by the hectares contributed to it, and you get a number. Simple one. Or allocate it based on the natural capital of the soils within that catchment, recognising that we want to sort of encourage efficient, optimal use of the resources, the finite resources we have. I'm not going to talk about in detail about the mechanisms that we've worked through around natural capital. That's probably for another day. But I've just got a couple of slides here to talk about the grandparenting options, some pros and cons, and then using an approach which is decouples from existing land use, just to advance the conversation. We know what grandparenting is. It's about an allocation based on a current or previous emissions. I mean, the beauty of it is it stops any further decline immediately. You essentially can't put a halt in any further decline. But it does effectively reward the landowner with the largest in leaching, and by doing that, it protects that capital investment. It really does disadvantage owners that might have been actively conserving, and it certainly seriously disadvantaged landowners that had the opportunity to increase their end losses, so that then they're in a disadvantaged position. But and again, there's some real arguments and conversation that's occur around the equity of that approach. But I think what it fails to do, and I think what its greatest weakness is, it fails to recognise that land's actually a finite resource. I think, to me, that's its weakness. Because you could get the same outcome in the river or the lake for a whole range of different uses, which would have a whole lot of different economies. And so if you can get through that from a grandering position, that's fine, but it would be interesting to see whether that was possible. If we think about an allocation directly to the underlying land resource, because it's independent of current land use, then owners with the same land resources would essentially have the same rights regardless of current use. And I think that's one of the debates around equity, is that if you have some landscape and your neighbour has the same landscape, should you be bound by the same rights or limits? And I suppose one of the advantages for something like a regional council, it's not targeting land use and intensity and activity. It's not being prescriptive. It's really just focused on an outcome. Here's your number. Manage it as you need. It actually provides certainty going forward in those catchments, for instance, where there isn't an issue right now, because you then have an indication of at what point you would have to mitigate. As I said, it provides a trigger. And it switches the focus on around the most efficient use of the natural resources we have. It's about trying to maintain flexibility and growth options, which again are more difficult under a grandparenting approach. So last slide, and just to make one point, transition plan. It's important, the importance of separating the allocation, that initial allocation, and if it doesn't fit, there is a real temptation to play with it till it does fit. But I think you need to separate that initial allocation from implementation. You might need a transition plan, and it might take time. It may not occur overnight. It might be a 30 to 50-year plan. But again, I think importance of separating the initial allocation from that implementation.
Thank you, Alec. And hand over to Susie, and then